Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, where we share the latest sales performance insights through in-depth discussion with experts. Season 3 of our show is your backstage pass to discovering how today's most successful sales and revenue ops teams support go-to-market strategy and improve sales performance. Plus, we'll explore what we can learn about incentives from different industries more broadly. Subscribe to hear how leaders are unlocking new growth, implementing the latest compensation trends, and their priorities for improving go-to-market performance. I'm your host, CEO of Forma.ai Nabeil Alazzam. Melissa, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining, and super excited to dive into our discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
I feel like I ask this question every time, but it's very relevant. I've gotten answers far and wide, but I'd love to have you share how you got into the crazy world of sales comp.
Yeah, I have such a convoluted path as well. I'm Melissa Fenner. I work at Docusign right now. Lead our sales planning and comp team, a small but mighty team. Shout out to them. But I ended up in comp. Yeah, very convoluted path. So probably the only satellite manufacturer you'll talk to this week. So that's how I started. And I worked actually in manufacturing supply chain for a while for Airbus, but on their defense side, not the planes, unfortunately. That probably would have been more fun. But I moved over actually into kind of operational consulting after that. And basically then started to work a little bit more in M&A, looking at operational synergies, and after day one, how do you integrate two companies? And just by chance, a lot of those companies ended up having quite a large field part to them. So how you go to market became quite a significant problem. Some of them were large pharmaceutical companies before I ended up in tech that had, a huge array of pharma reps. Some of them were advertising companies that had account executives, just like you do in the SaaS world. And after a short stint in M&A, I actually started to work in joint ventures and shifted gears a little bit, but using a lot of those skills to instead proactively think about how the consulting company I was working for could partner with other tech companies going forwards that were up and coming in the space. A lot of API providers at that time during that era of digital transformation and point solutions versus platform solutions. And then eventually Docusign became one of my customers. And the rest is history. And I've been at Docusign for 4 years. And that was how I ended up coming over here into the GTM space. And I was really focused on some of the kind of auxiliary teams initially when I came over here, the customer success side of the house, partner. And now I'm responsible for global sales and comp planning and execution, which is about 2,800 field members that we design and execute compensation for, as well as going into the annual planning process. But yes, far cry from my time in aerospace and defense.
Yeah, I feel like it's the moment you get into like how do you operationalize something, I imagine the design of incentives starts to take hold in those conversations. Like how do you translate an objective to an actual activity or behavior?
It was really important when we were going through a lot of those M&As actually, and that we would try and build a culture as well as get people to work together. And so behaviors, I remember working with a behavioral economist, that was on the team. And he had all sorts of experiments that he was like a PhD, and he'd done a lot of these experiments about how you really change, like micro changes will change huge behaviors. And we were applying a lot of that thinking, which was really interesting for me to learn without that background, to how we designed a lot of the incentives. And it did really help actually to bring these very established companies together under one roof and under one cultural practice, and get them to adopt standard practices that were maybe not standard in the company that had just been acquired. So I think it did kind of ignite a little bit of that interest in the kind of the softer parts of business, how you influence behavior, how you influence change, as well as the operational metrics that we had to monitor and the financial metrics that were the desired outcome that we were trying to drive. So it's I think that array of problems, making sure that you are checking the box and culturally and behaviorally, as well as hitting the operational and the financial metrics. I think that's always been a very common thread in my career, and I always look for problems that are a little bit of all of those things to tackle. I think that's where I really enjoy working the most.
Yeah, the sales ops, sales comp strategy, execution, kind of a people element. Humans aren't all the same, right? And it's like you have to factor all that in. To me, that's why it's such a challenging role, but it's also such a rewarding one if if you can do that, especially when planning and execution are together, because then you have that kind of full circle.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of like the experience you've had in the past and the big changes that you must have seen, just to double click on that, like how have you seen these big changes get handled and what's gone right, what's gone wrong?
I've seen it go right and wrong. So I'll start like communication is so critical. It's a really emotional topic. We have financial obligations in all of our lives, and our commissions, when they're variable, are they can be a constraint or they can be a huge helper. I love delivering the good news of, yep, hey, this is a big fat check this month. Congratulations, over having to say, everyone wants to avoid a clawback. No one likes that conversation, right? So but in both situations, positive and negative emotions can be at play. And so, I think communication is key. And it has to be on an ongoing basis. And I have made mistakes too myself in this situation where there's not been enough proactive communication up front. And it's almost like you need to say the same thing 7 times for it to land, and for people to fully understand, because this is not what they live and breathe every day. What ends up in the bank account is critical and they're always thinking about it. But, if you're going through quota true ups, for example, and you're trying to handle adding earlies after the fact, but they want to be able to forecast, that's been a really trying one for us, where we're still working through exactly the right kind of cadence of communication, the level of detail that people need. So there are no surprises. No one wants to see their commissions change overnight, certainly not in a negative way. So I think communication is at the crux of what can work well and what can really go wrong. When I took this role, I said I never want to fall into that trap where a comp team is looked at as the enemy. We're not here trying to catch you out. We're here to make you successful. We want you to be successful doing exactly what the company needs to be a broader success. Particularly as a public company, our shareholders are also our customer. But we really wanted to try and build a culture of transparency and just trust in what we were doing. Sometimes you have your hands held by the systems you're forced to use, or some of the just kind of operational constraints that everyone has. But I think communication has been at the crux of trying to get to that point of being completely transparent with the field and building that trust and credibility. And I think that's going to be an ongoing journey for a long time. Once if you get things even a little bit wrong, that takes 10 times the amount of time to build that trust back up. So it's always about accuracy, and ensuring that any exceptions we make in particular are not just auditable for compliance and that level of trust, but we could easily explain why we're making that exception positive or negative in a way that a rep can actually understand why we've made that call, rather than think it was arbitrary and they've been punished, or arbitrary and someone else has been rewarded when the others weren't. So yeah, communication, I think, is the thing that I see go right and wrong the most frequent. But yeah, long journey to get that right. But over communicate would be my suggestion.
Your point on like, yeah, you need to do 7 times is like, that's not an exaggeration at all, I think. I mean, it is, you see it time and time again. It's, no one wants to feel like the rug is getting pulled out from underneath them, and especially with comp. And so you're always better to over communicate. I think one thing that, you've mentioned before and on some of the panels that we've been on and things that are relevant, but the concept of like piloting and learning and kind of the iteration. So I like would love to, dig into that, because I think you have that experience, you've seen it firsthand, and I think it would be great for the audience to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm such a strong proponent of pilots. It's really hard to figure out midway through a year, like I want to take a small batch of sellers and treat them differently. Equal earning potential has to be at the high, has to be assured without assuring a payout, which will manipulate behaviors and make the pilot null and void. But we had some really good success running a pilot where we shored up that equal earning potential, and we had really good results coming out of the pilot. It was really tough, though, to say, who do we want on the pilot? Who's going to be the most representative sample?
Yeah.
So that took some thinking through. But when we were moving from monthly recurring revenue to an annual recurring revenue model, we really needed to understand that movement from the perspective of forecasting, policy, compensation plans, what it would do it to change the behavior from looking at monthly contracts or contracts that will build monthly to thinking more about the annual value and ongoing customer lifetime value of our customers along annual plus timelines. Really different way of thinking about what you want to get out of your customers. And so we needed to design a lot of comp plans. And I think the pilot allowed us to go through that typical, Monte Carlo simulation, scenario planning, but then bring it to life, whereby reps could talk to what happened on the pilot, what they did differently, how forecasting changed, a lot of those process or procedural changes that they then experienced. And I think we generated actually more champions of that transformation when we went live at scale by running that pilot process. So I highly recommend it. It's very tricky, going back to communication, to say, I've got 30 reps here or 100 reps here, and you guys have been singled out to take part, because they immediately think it's going to be punitive or a negative experience. And it really took us about 6 months to work through that, but we ran the pilot for a year. And like I say, by the end, we had got to the point where we actually had champions for the change that was coming. And they felt that actually they were now ahead of the curve because they'd already gone through it. And we probably kept 80% of what we trialed in that pilot for the design of the next fiscal year. I think as a lever to test things, it's a really powerful one. And I highly recommend it.
100%. I think it's underutilized because it's hard. The decision of where you roll it out, who is defined in the population, is actually really tricky. I've seen, attempts at this where you do an opt-in. The danger there is who's going to opt in. The people that are very acutely aware of how the comp metrics work, and they see this as an upside for them. So you're kind of, you're almost in a way, you're biasing the outcome of the pilot. But the right way to do it is to kind of figure out the right representative population, do the hard work of communication, and as you were talking about before, I had an advisor tell me this early, and it's very, very powerful, which is the hardest things in life are, they sit behind dragons, and you need to run at the dragon and fight through that hard challenge to get to the prize. And most people just see the dragon and they turn around and they run the other way. And I think, this is a perfect example of what you underwent is a big change. I mean, shifting metrics like that, you have to fundamentally grasp a totally different thing. And so, I don't know. I imagine what would have been much harder to build up that same champion if you hadn't gone through this pilot approach.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we'd have had the noise of the pilot, but at scale, with nearly 3,000 reps taking it on all at once. And that would have been a far worse situation. And there was a lot of blind corners, actually, that we thought long and hard before we launched a pilot, and we still uncovered a lot of blind corners. So thank goodness we were able to do that and work through those issues with a small group, and it allowed us to solve them much faster. And then be ready to roll it out en masse. So yeah, I think it's I think you're looking at moving to maybe consumption-based compensation, or you're changing that model and going away from maybe seat-based to consumption-based pricing. Pilot's a really great way to tackle that. If you're going through different time periods of like MER to ARR, that's how we used it. But I think any of those big transformations, trying to pilot what the comp is going to drive and the types of deals that compensation structure will support versus not, best done through a pilot.
Yeah. And so in terms of being able to potentially do it again, as an example, like if you had to do it right now, any changes you'd make, or any recommendations on how you'd select the population?
So we went for our most varied industry group. We kind of called it geos. It's we might have fins and HLS, and we went for a varied group. I would suggest that. And we did it across all segments. Initially, though, we were only doing AEs, and when we added in the post-sales teams, things changed a lot. So I would start with a mixture of resources, definitely. I would say run it for no more than 6 months, and then pivot and try and get another 6 months out. We did do that, and that helped us to test at least two at once. The thing I would change, broken record here, but we didn't communicate to those that weren't on the pilot what was happening on the pilot. And I think it's because we didn't want any noise or distraction across the rest of the field. But I also think knowing now that we were going to stick with like 80% of what was happening, and also that everyone is going to talk anyway, it would have been probably a better strategic choice to say, we're actually going to publicize this as an effort. We're going to be completely transparent about what's happening and why, and what we're thinking, and what's working, what's not working, and have a broader conversation and ask for more feedback from a broader audience too. Even if they're not on the pilot, they might have a suggestion that would have been helpful. So I think that's what we didn't do that I would now do, and make sure we were maybe just once a quarter checking in with the broader base.
Yeah, the transparency in itself builds trust ahead of the change, in addition to all the feedback that you're going to get incrementally to what you've done before.
Yeah, and one thing I've learned is most people talk about the downsides of compensation. When it's gone wrong, when they've missed out, when they're unhappy, very few people shout and scream about a big paycheck, for good reason.
Mm.
So I think, what happened when we weren't part of the core of communication and the hubbub of what's happening on this pilot was only the negative was being shared, because that's just human nature. We all glom onto the negative and we hold on to that much, for a much longer time than we do think about the positives. And I think we would have maybe had a bit more of a balanced takeaway amongst the field from the pilot that we've now had to kind of fight to establish when we adopted a lot of those changes in this fiscal year. So yeah, lots learned, but overall it was a really good experience. And I think the 30 or so reps that we had involved actually walked away championing what we were rolling out and being happy that they'd taken part.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love the concept, especially when if you're doing such a drastic change and the amount of risk that you take on for the business in terms of like run rate operations, like the ability to test. And I like the multiple cycles is actually a great, like, conceptually, because it gives you, instead of this once a year kind of plan, which we talked about before as well. It's like this ability to kind of think about this as like an iterative process to get the change. Just to double click on the concept of change. So obviously, if you think about the sales comp world, it's like sales comp in of itself is kind of the final step. All these rivers upstream flow into sales comp, territory, quota, comp. So I'm curious, given again all the experience you have across different industries and the work that you've done within Docusign, what do you believe is the right order of
Mm.
building out and executing on this planning?
Yeah, I think, the right order and then the order you have to operate in are not one and the same necessarily every year. But, I think sticking to territory, quota, comp makes a ton of sense, because you want to segment your book of business and all of your customers up front to then be able to design around. And, we do have 4 segments as we go to market, and they do have variances in their compensation based off of things like deal cycle is a basic one that we always deal with in the SaaS industry. So I think starting with segmentation makes the most sense. Now, we were actually forced to start with comp and follow up with segmentation decisions and quota decisions. We were close knit, but we were making a large kind of transformational change for the company around our segments and a product led growth strategy versus our direct channel and how we were going to leverage both. And those decisions weren't quite ready when we needed to be able to redefine our comp plans, especially around that annual recurring revenue concept. So we needed a lot of time to set those comp plans up just to operationalize them, but the segmentation decisions weren't ready. So what we had to do is build in a lot more assumptions and guardrails.
Yep.
So we assumed a certain amount of account potential and the different directions that quota might go in, how high it might be, if we were going to goal people on metric A over metric B. And we had a lot of different scenarios that we were planning around, ready to pull the trigger when the time came on which direction we were going. So we had to build in different scenarios. But as I mentioned, guardrails, they were really important as well. So depending on where we ended up and who was going to be in the mix, things like determining adding higher floors for things. So for our SQOs, for example, we added in a higher deal floor. because irrespective of then what happened with the segmentation and where these reps were going to be working, we understood that, you were only going to have an SQO qualify if it met X as an absolute value in terms of the deal when it was input. Drove a little bit of gaming when launched, but generally speaking, it's allowed us to build a plan ready for the ambiguity of not necessarily knowing how the customers were going to be broken out. The other guardrail that we went with is also kind of adding in some mid-year language around reopening the comp plans for definition and design. And we let the reps that might be impacted in that way know that might happen and put them on initially a semi-annual plan. And said, like, for the first 6 months, we're going to operate this way, either due to new leadership or to unintended consequences that we perceive may happen. We're going to then look and reassess potentially what H2 needs to look like. And they were actually very accepting of that because they knew about it up front, to that concept of transparency. And that's helped build that trust, but also given us some ability to pivot when we experience some of the unintended consequences, or we saw, an uptick that wasn't quite forecasted for, and so it's not in the budget, and we have to kind of just redesign a little bit around that. So I think those were the two guardrails that helped us. But generally, I think you've got to build in adjustable levers and have some scenarios in the back of your pocket to be able to kind of pivot when you're going through that level of change. And if you are going to operate outside of the territory quota comp linearity of 1, 2, and 3, you may have to revisit the comp once you've got territory and quota in place. But ideally, you're starting with territory and moving through it in that fashion.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because at the end of the day, this is where it's like comp is all of the upstream logic needs to funnel into how you define it. And so, in that perfect world, you are kind of going through that order. But yes, sometimes changes happen where you need to shift behavior, but your upstream systems aren't ready for it. There's upstream market impact. And I mean, we've seen this. So it's like that language of flexibility is not just about putting in T's and C's. It goes back to your point earlier, like communicate is like that's an important subtlety that you don't want to then just pull the rug under someone 6 months into the year and be like, oh, that, lever that you thought you had at play is no longer a mechanic that holds true. And so,
absolutely.
Maybe if we shift gears to a segment that, think about as kind of like the hot takes of the world of SPM, and I would love, so maybe some of the more controversial ideas that maybe as a group, as a collective, we've kind of taken as de facto, but really, should we think about something different? I'm curious, if you have any that come to mind.
Well, the first one that comes to mind is accelerators are, only used in over attainment. I think accelerators and even decelerators, if you want to go in the direction of the stick versus the carrot, can be used without having to move into that, over 100% attainment space. For example, if you've got a strategic product, you've just launched a new product, or you want to see more of your revenue shift to that product, and you want to start rewarding reps, particularly in a pre-sales motion, think XDRs working on sourcing SQOs. If an SQO is one of those strategic products, maybe it can be worth more to them, or maybe you can give them a commission uplift. I prefer commission uplift over credit uplifts, so you don't mask true attainment, but you can start to give them that commission uplift against SQOs that meet the right checkboxes. Or similarly, if you're a solution consultant and you're getting involved in demos across multitudes of different products, maybe you're working in the most complex and the mid-complex product types. If you really want that mid-complex to start to move into being more of your revenue, perhaps you better reward them for the number of demos that they're doing there, again with some kind of commission uplift, or if they hit more than 50% being in that realm, or something along those lines. I think it can be a nice way to underscore what the objective is without entirely suggesting it's a priority. It's just a preferred behavior, and I think that's where accelerators can be used without talking about over attainment. The second thing I'd probably say is I'm actually not one for changing comp plans every year. I think we're kind of taught that and it's seen as best practice, but I think it can be a bit of a distraction, or signal a lack of faith in the long-term direction if you continuously change a comp plan. I think a level of consistency about how to make money is needed, and you should be building a comp plan that can grow with the company, at least for 2 to 3 years. So I vote for consistency over change year over year. I think the trade-off is you probably have to prioritize certain roles to go through a level of change in year one, and then follow in year two, bringing other kind of auxiliary roles through the same level of change. And then by year three, you're maybe all coming together, because it's pretty hard to change everything all at once if we've got like 15 roles on a compensation plan. So it does need to be tiered sometimes, but generally speaking, I vote for consistency over continuous change, year over year. But yeah, I'd say those are maybe two of the things I don't necessarily prescribe to all that much. I think there's better use of accelerators or decelerators, like I mentioned, without over-attainment being the qualifier, and trying to build consistency and what you expect from your reps per their comp plan year over year might see a more long-term uptick in the right behaviors that you're trying to drive.
Yeah, no, for sure. I liken it to how you engage with consumer loyalty programs. If
Yeah.
all of a sudden your airline loyalty program just completely pulled the rug underneath you, I mean, like, think about how disruptive that would be. And for the most part, they are generally consistent. But this is the one piece I think maybe just because I do believe in this, but I also believe in dynamic comp. Like, it's kind of like, so those two things seem contradictory, but they're actually not, because you can't have incentives that change on a weekly basis and pull the rug out from everyone every week. It's not. So the foundation, I believe the foundation layer of comp should
Yes.
be consistent. And then to your point on accelerators being kind of used in multiple ways, I mean, as an example, it might be like, we have a product launch, anyone who hits this sub target of this new product launch within this quarter gets a bump or accelerator that gets added to their base comp. But then I go into every year knowing like this is the base structure. Um,
Yes.
and so to me, it's like there's a lot of design and strategies to go into that, because like, what is the fundamental base that you're comfortable with over years, like 5 to 10 years, that aligns with the long-term business, and then how do you separate out the what I would want to say is the more short-term strategic elements of it. And so I don't know what you've seen in across your experience and different industries, but even something like pulling out like product classification, like these 5 SKUs are tier one products, these are tier two. The base comp plan might pay differently for tier one versus tier two, but your ability to redefine what sits in those is a little bit, up to kind of like the intermediate business strategy.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Like, you keep the foundation, the components of the compensation plan, sometimes even weighting, you can keep those pretty standard, but nothing's ever perfect, and continuous improvement is key, I think, in compensation. And in order for compensation to evolve with a company, you do want tweaks year over year, but 80% should kind of like stay pretty monotonous until you're going through a period of transformation, or there's an inflection point in the business model or the business outcomes or productivity. But I think, if you look at like maybe using kickers or auxiliary programs, those are year over year change, sometimes quarter over quarter even. You want to drive a particularly short-term goal. Spiffs as well, quarter over quarter changes, of course. But I think the other thing I look at is when you put guardrails into a plan, like say a gate, for example, or a hurdle. You might set it at one level for the first year to drive a minimum level of performance that's maybe a little bit higher, to drive that adoption, get people used to the new concept. Maybe they've never had that guardrail or constraint in their commissions before. And then as that behavior becomes adopted and more mainstream, you can start to lower that. It's not necessarily needed as much as a guardrail. Equally, if you see it's not been adopted, maybe you have to increase it. So I think things like that are the tweaks that I think about making year over year, as opposed to rip and replace of a comp.
100%. Yeah, I mean, again, get back to the point. Clearly, there's a very big theme here, but it's like the communication element. The cost of communication has to be taken into account with the magnitude of change. And so there is a cost. I mean, I've seen organizations where they're 3 months into the year and the reps still have no clue how they're going to get paid on a transaction. And it's like, then incentives aren't really driving much if they don't know what's actually, the outcome or the reward of doing a certain behavior. So
Yeah, enablement is the unsung hero. That team is critical for a successful deployment of compensation and people understanding how they can maximize their commissions.
yeah, 100%. And I mean, yeah, actually, when you factor in all the change that a rep is going through, I mean, especially with technology shifts that we're seeing right now, like everything is about to go through this paradigm shift we're seeing across like the way that the tools they use, how they use them, how they engage with the customer. And then you factor in big changes in comp. I mean, it's a lot to take on. No, this has been an absolutely amazing discussion. I think the points that you made on not only communication is a constant theme, but the pushing the world of sales comp to do more testing and more experimentation and kind of bring the organization along for a ride through like the transparent communication, I think is something that more organizations should do and try. And I appreciate you coming on the show, Melissa, and sharing your feedback and your experience.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I love tuning in. I think this is just one of the greatest podcasts we have to think about, how people are tackling what is a really changing space from technology, and also how we're thinking about incentives. I think it's always been used as almost like an execution operations kind of role or department, cost center, but now we're starting to see it as the real strategic lever that it can be. I always enjoy the opportunity to geek out, and I'll be listening into the next set of speakers as well. Thank you for the opportunity. Love catching up with you.
The Sales Compensation Show is brought to you by Forma.ai, the sales performance management platform that fully integrates sales planning with rapid, scalable incentive compensation management. Our data platform brings together how you can plan and manage the entire lifecycle of territories, quotas, and incentives. With global customers like Autodesk, Stryker, and Hootsuite, we enable go-to-market teams to plan and deploy even the most complex SPM strategies at speed, taking you from idea to execution instantly. To learn more about Forma.ai, visit our website at Forma.ai. Hit the subscribe button and find more episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.